How should US police forces be reformed as protests against police brutality go on? So do calls to cut funding, even abolishing law enforcement agencies. But is there the political will for genuine change? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The killing of George Floyd last month triggered protests across the US and elsewhere against police brutality. The 4 Minneapolis officers who arrested the 46-year-old Black American are back in court, charged with murder and manslaughter. Demands for justice and drastic changing to policing are being made.
No lives matter, Black lives matter.
Activists say officers routinely discriminate against minorities and use excessive force when making arrests. The protest demands include cutting funding for law enforcement agencies, stripping police of military gear such as armoured trucks and grenade launchers, and some even want to abolish police altogether.
We wanted to make sure that people were here to uplift the demands of the community, which is to defund the police. And for many people, that means abolish policing itself as an institution. If we occupy this space, then we control that narrative, and they cannot say that the people were satisfied if they do not defund the NYPD by $1 billion. And really, the demand is not just about the police. It's actually about ending poverty. It's actually about creating safety by funding the kinds of initiatives and social services and infrastructure, public health infrastructure, that actually generate safety for communities, and not just rich, white, money communities, but for all communities.
There are police officers in other countries that don't even have guns. You know, so America has this explicit violence that is primarily enacted against brown and black people. And that's through the government, you know, a channel that we're supposed to be voting for, that's supposed to be protecting us.
I'll just say that I think it's important right now for people to come out. This is a critical moment in history. People should be on the streets demanding for real reform and change that is going to help all of us. And this is another moment in civil rights history. I think that we will see reform and change.
We're already stretched thin with where we're at. Losing more law enforcement is not the answer, because those threats of violence, those criminal acts still occur. Someone still has to show up, take a report, talk to victims, identify suspect, make arrests, present the case to the district attorney. The job's not going to go away because the school police decided to be disbanded. So I think it's irresponsible to do that.
The Democrat-controlled House of Representatives passed a police reform bill named after George Floyd. The legislation aims to ban chokeholds, combat racial profiling, and establish a national database to track police misconduct. But the Republican-controlled Senate is unlikely to pass the law. Let's bring in our guests. From New York, human rights activist Jamira Burley. From Nutley, New Jersey, Stephen Rogers, retired police lieutenant and member of the advisory board of Donald J. Trump for President 2020. And from Washington, D.C., Elizabeth Anker, professor of American Studies and Political Science at George Washington University. A warm welcome to you all. I'd like to begin in New Jersey with Stephen Rogers. You are a retired police lieutenant. Defunding the police, Shoal, is it a good idea? Does it need to be done?
Well, we're already seeing how bad an idea it is. Over the past 48 hours, more people were shot in Seattle. New York City, 77 people wounded in 55 shootings over this past week. Los Angeles, the crime rate has spiked to 270%, and it's just going on and on and on. Defunding the police is a politically correct way of saying let's get rid of the police. Now, there are certain areas that the police can certainly not become too much involved in, but when it comes to crime fighting, you need police officers. And I've got to tell you, what is troubling is that the people who are suffering the most are minorities begging for police to come in. And it's the Democrats and the socialists who are saying, you don't need cops, we'll take care of you.
It's interesting. You're in New Jersey. A couple of years ago, I was in New Jersey. I was in Trenton. And what I saw there actually made me do a double take. I saw military vehicles, police dressed like they were in Baghdad or they were in Afghanistan. I did have to do a double take because I thought I was back in those places. It shocked me at the level of militarization that's taken place. So policing has changed, Stephen, over the last few years because of that kind of thing. So can you understand that people are more afraid of the police now than they ever have been?
Well, that's a myth. I could tell you that people welcome police officers through community policing methodologies in each of their communities. With regard to what you just identified, I understand it, but it was during those times that we were very involved with active shooters. You had no idea what school was next, what corporation was next. So the police had to be very, very prepared to engage in pretty vicious criminals with high-powered weapons. You don't see much of that anymore. It seems like we have a handle on a lot of these incidents that are potentially dangerous. But the fact is that what's not being told by the mainstream media are the success stories. And there are many of them, far more success stories than what we are seeing on the air with regard to police-community relations.
Jamira, Burley in New York, there's nothing to worry about, says Stephen Rogers. The police are wonderful.
I think it's easy to say if you have never seen people who look like you being thrown up against a car, have their life taken away by having someone put their knee on their neck, or have police officers shoot unarmed Black men as they're walking away. Police officers do not make us safe. It is time that we have a larger conversation of reimagining what safety looks like for Black and brown communities. And I think to your point, you know, I was in Baltimore and in Baton Rouge during the uprising a few years ago. And the fact that we had tanks on American streets, intimidating everyday Americans when we're just trying to protest the violence that police officers are inflicting against our communities, I think goes to show you how we have totally moved away from trying to make our community safer to placing folks into a very militarized community, which oftentimes intensifies incidents of violence.
But Jamira, it has to be said that if you're calling for the defunding of the police, that's to ordinary Americans, to most people around the world, that's quite a shocking statement. People want the police. Why call it defunding?
You know, I think it would actually be, I mean, to be honest, I'm ready for the abolishment of police officers. And I say that because, you know, it's easy for folks to think that, you know, abolishing the police is somehow a radical thing. But over the last few decades, we've defunded mental health. We've defunded public education. We've defunded institutions that will actually make our communities not only safer, but prosper. And so I think, again, this is an opportunity for us to have a larger conversation, not saying that we won't need folks to investigate crime and to continue to ensure that folks are safe, but we have to reimagine what that looks like. And as of now, the current institution of police is actually more dangerous to our country than it has ever been.
Elizabeth Anke in Washington, D.C., is there any historical precedent for this idea of defunding the police? Is there a modern equivalent of it, or has this come out as a result directly of the George Floyd killings, of BLM, Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, the idea of putting less money into policing, which currently makes up a very large share of most city budgets, that is not new. People have been arguing for decades and decades since the civil rights movement in the United States that more money should be put into social services that would prevent crime. Social services like supporting more public education, supporting employment, supporting healthcare. That would actually prevent a lot of people who end up turning to crime. The phrase defunding the police is rather new in the sense that it summarizes that movement. The movement is calling for placing less money into police budgets and more money into some of these other forms of social services, preserving the police solely for issues of high violence, especially since the police, you know, their methods, what they have available to them is state violence. And all the other ways in which police are asked to intervene in nonviolent issues, such as homelessness or poverty or mental health crises, boosting the funding for those. And that part of it, the real kind of specificity of it, that is new.
So, Stephen Rogers, prevention obviously is better than cure, particularly in medicine. Could the same be applied then? Do we defund the police by a little bit to put more money into preventative measures for people getting into trouble in the first place?
Well, I agree with the prevention end of this. However, we must make it clear that, for example, the minority community is not the enemy of the police. The police are not the enemies of the minority community or any community. But the enemy I see here are politicians of both sides. They've promised so much to so many for so many years and never delivered. So I would not say not one dime should be taken away from the police. But there are a lot of other treasuries, if you will, that could be tapped into. But keep in mind, to the guest that mentioned that she would say that the abolishment of the police would be okay. Well, just a couple nights ago, a senator in Michigan who supports defunding police was badly beaten by the very people he's supporting. First thing he did was call 911, ask for the police. So you need police, you need them there for a purpose, and that's to protect and serve. But the idea of prevention, especially into mental health, I think we all support that.
Jamira, when you hear the words protect and serve, what do you think?
I think that's incorrect. There's been many courts that have already ruled that police officers' job is actually not to protect, right? It's to enforce laws and to uphold laws. And so that's a very different concept that the gentleman just spoke of. And so again, I think I understand that there is a need for investigation for high-level crimes, for violent crimes. But as of now, police officers have a wide breadth, a wide range of work that they do that oftentimes make them, one, they are not up to code. They don't understand those communities. They oftentimes, it creates hostile environments. And I would actually say many Black folks would say the police officers are an enemy of their community because of how we've been treated for so long. And you can see that by the amounts of unarmed Black and brown women who have been killed by the police, sometimes walking away. And also, I want to flag, it's easy for folks to think about what's the amazing examples of police officers when they've come into communities, but also the vast majority of times of them interacting with communities of color, it has been from a place of violence and trauma. And so we can talk about the good examples, but I don't think the good examples outweigh the bad examples that we've seen oftentimes displayed by both police cameras and by eyewitnesses' accounts on the scene.
Elizabeth, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but I do want your thoughts and Stephen's thoughts on both of this. I'll start with Stephen first. Stephen, surely the idea that the police aren't protecting and serving their communities comes from the fact that they're not reflective of their communities. You need more Black and brown officers. You need more diversity within the police force. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree with that. And I'm a strong advocate of police officers coming from the communities that they aren't in fact serving. But keep in mind that, look, I could just point you right to Chicago. Those people are begging. They've been begging for years for help. For who? For the police. They're being gunned down. Their kids are being shot. And by the way, they're not being shot to death by cops. They're being shot to death because of the black on black crime. I mean, so that at the end of the day, we need police officers. But to your point, I am totally in agreement that we should have police officers hide from the communities that we are called to serve. People want their police officers. They know they need them. They want them. And the fact of the matter is, as you and I are speaking, over this past few days, 8 police officers were shot, 2 of them last night. This is a dangerous job. And it's the police who are called to do what? To take the bullet for the citizens, no matter what color, race, or creed they are.
Elizabeth, we will come to you, but I think Jamira has something she'd like to say. I can hear her.
Yeah, I think it's a false narrative, and it's funny that you give the example of Chicago, because Chicago is the same city that actually had a secret police and had a secret prison where they were torturing African Americans for decades. And so the idea that Black and brown communities are calling for police, no, we're calling for safer communities. And unfortunately, the only recourse we currently have is the institution of police. And so I do believe in diversity, but we're asking Black and brown folks to go into a white supremacy system that has never been set up to actually protect people in communities of color.
Elizabeth, in Washington, D.C., there's a number of points that I want to ask you about. Firstly, let's just get to the simple one, about diversity. Looking at it from the outside in to America, it seems incredible to me that the police still has problems with race when it comes to their own communities, the communities that they're in. Is that accurate?
Well, I mean, one thing that has been shown is that having police officers coming from their own communities does not necessarily end the kinds of police violence that we see, because the structures of policing about law and order are often weigh more heavily upon Black and brown communities, and that doesn't necessarily change given the makeup of who is doing the policing. Policing has had a very long history in the United States, and part of it originated in the slave patrols during when this nation practiced slavery. And then the way that the slave patrols evolved in after the Civil War to still police Black and brown people in public. And that is part of our history of policing. And because that still hasn't left us and it's still part of the institution, that is part of why we still see that no matter what some of these smaller reforms do, policing still often is significantly more violent to a lot of the minority communities that we see in the U.S., particularly with Black Americans and especially with brown immigrants right now as well.
In academic circles, in policing circles, Elizabeth, is there any studies that have been done that you can suggest or cite that take a look at this very issue of diversity? And are the police listening to those studies? Do you have any friends on the police force that are like, we do have a problem and we need to address it?
I think, especially in the last few weeks, there has been a real public reckoning with forms of police, not only with police violence, but also with the unaccountability of policing, right? In many of our other institutions within the U.S., when people are not following the law, there's methods for them to be held accountable or for them to be fired. But we've seen that in police forces across the U.S., there's a real barrier to that. So that a lot of police officers, when they use excessive force up to and including killing people, there really is no way for them to be held accountable unless through a lot of these really, really public trials. And even then, that doesn't happen. So part of the issue is not only just who is on the force, but the ways in which people are held accountable for the kinds of force that they use when they're on policing. And so there have been, given the public reckoning of this, I think we have been seeing a lot of police officers and certainly legislators in localities and in states saying we need to be able to push for more accountability, for less violence. But as some of our other speakers noted, given the ways in which we already have a very militarized police force, and given the ways that there are serious blocks right now to accountability, it still seems like some of those smaller reforms might not be able to do what a lot of activists are calling for, which is really trying to cut down on violence and equalize the treatment of all citizens across America.
Stephen Rogers, there is a bunker mentality when it comes to the police force, criticism of the police force, particularly in the government, in the US government, is always seen through this lens of kind of patriotism. These are the people that are doing their duties. It's a very difficult job. Mistakes often happen. That's not good enough anymore, is it, given what we've been hearing and what we've been saying in the last few weeks? Is it time for a real, hard, cold look at what police in America means?
I think that there should be a real hardcore look within the police ranks, and I have strongly advocated that good cops need to step up and turn in bad cops. We have 800,000 police officers in this country, and there are racists, there are bad cops like we saw in Minneapolis. That man, Mr. Floyd, should still be alive, and those cops should have been arrested immediately and put in prison. But saying that, when we talk about accountability, I agree, but it must be inclusive. Judges should be held accountable for letting violent offenders out of their courtrooms immediately after a pretrial motion. Politicians, as Elizabeth said, what Elizabeth actually articulated, I heard in the 70s and 80s. The same old story from politicians with the same old music, and nothing gets done. So if we're going to look at criminal justice reform, we have to look at the whole picture. But keep in mind, what we're seeing today is the result of so-called defunding the police. Violence is getting as high as it ever has. And I will tell you this, that the blood of crime victims will flow like never before in this nation's history if we don't put a stop to this idea of defunding and dismantling police departments.
Jamira, you're shaking your head there, but he makes a point. You get rid of the police, there is going to be violence.
I disagree. I think we have to reinvest in preventative measures and reinvest in actually healing our communities. As the speaker mentioned earlier, we know that the police is a concept that can be traced all the way back to slavery. And America has yet to reckon with slavery in this country in a way that actually creates healing and reconciliation. And so, yes, will violence happen in communities of color? Yes. Will violence often happen in white communities? Because when white folks have white on white violence, Black folks have Black on white violence. Because when you're living in a community, these things do occur, but that doesn't mean that we should not reinvest in other areas that actually prevent violence long term versus just giving a blank check to the police officers to be able to come into our communities, kill our men and women, and not have any form of accountability when it happens.
Stephen, let's get to the actual nuts and bolts of this. The Democrats have passed a reform bill. It does address things like racial profiling, tough techniques when it comes to arresting people. It won't, in all likelihood, be passed by the Senate. But is that a good place to start? Is police reform, in your opinion, a good place to start?
Well, I believe criminal justice reform is a good place to start. As I shared with you, it should not only be the police that we should be looking at, but the courts, as well as the politicians who are making all these promises. Look, the police don't wake up in the morning and say, look, I'm just going to go kill somebody, whether they're black, white, or whatever. Once again, I want to just emphasize the point that race relations in this country, we're having problems, yes, but it's not the police that's causing it. It's not the minority community. It's the politicians. It's the system. We have to work on changing the system so that politicians are more responsive to the people. And keep in mind, you asked your prior guest about will violence spike? Well, and she says no, but tell that to the people in Seattle right now and the people in Chicago and people in New York.
But Stephen, I have to say, you are part of the re-elect Donald J. Trump campaign. This is a president that just shared a tweet and then deleted it of somebody saying white power. This is a man that has enabled a lot of radicals. And here you are saying it's the fault of the politicians, one of the politicians whom you're a supporter of.
Look, with regard to that tweet, I understand, and I don't know this, that he didn't hear the word white power. I know the president. I've spoken to him. I've got to tell you, the man hasn't a racist bone in his body. And that's all news. That's all the hype. You see, what you just articulated to me is what the mainstream media in this country is doing. It's adding fuel to the fires of racism. This is the same president who just introduced a police reform bill that has the First Step Act, that especially a multitude of minorities benefited from that. He's recommended more money into community policing. These are the things nobody seems to hear or care about. All they want to do is get rid of the police. Well, you get rid of the police, this is what's going to happen. Violence is going to increase. How can I say that? Because it's happening now.
Elizabeth Anker in Washington, D.C., there is a surprised look on your face as Stephen Nutley was speaking. What are your thoughts?
Well, I have a few thoughts. I mean, one is that although the speaker suggests that this is what the violence on the street is being caused by defunding, one thing we know right now is that police budgets are at an all-time high. If we just look at the breakdown of cities in Washington, D.C., New York, police budgets get much more money than everything else, sometimes even more than education and mental health care and all of health care and employment support and housing combined. So this isn't a problem where police are already defunded. Part of our problem is that we've actually defunded so many other parts of our society. We have no social safety net, and we ask the police to solve all of these problems for us. In addition, part of my surprise is that one of the reasons that we're seeing people out on the streets right now is in part because of the incitement from our current president, right? We've seen our president say a lot of racist things. We've seen him support violence even in his own rallies. We've seen him call for violence against people who are protesting against him at his rallies. So part of what we're seeing right now is also people worried that at the very highest echelons of power in our presidency, we have a president who supports and condones the very forms of police violence that people are out there protesting about.
A very spirited debate there. I want to thank all our guests, Jamira, Burley, Stephen Rogers and Elizabeth Anker. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.